The first time the gate refused to open for me, I told myself it had to be a glitch. A bad scan. A dead battery. Anything except what my gut already suspected. The HOA had decided to punish an entire neighborhood over one emergency call, and they were willing to lock people out to prove they could. By the time I backed up and tried again, I could feel eyes on me through tinted windshields. The kind of silence you only get in a gated community when everyone is pretending they're not watching. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, then at the keypad that suddenly felt like a courtroom witness stand. If the HOA could rewrite access rules in less than 3 days, what else could they rewrite before anyone had time to breathe? Because this wasn't about safety. Not really. It started with a 911 call. And the way the HOA said the words, "for the good of the community," like it was a weapon. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood with a gate that's mostly there for vibes. The kind of place where people talk about security like it's a lifestyle choice. 2 lanes, a keypad, a camera, and a guard who came and went depending on the budget and the season. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough that everyone forgot how quickly a gate can turn from convenience to control. My unit sits near the entrance, close enough that I hear the hinge squeak when the arm lifts. I'm also the kind of person who reads every single notice that gets taped to the kiosk, even the ones that are obviously meant to scare people into compliance. I've learned that in a homeowners association drama situation, the notices tell you more than the board ever will. The board president, let's call her Ms. R, was the type who treated the rulebook like a personality trait. She wasn't loud in a messy way. She was loud in a polished way, where she could say something harsh while smiling, then act offended if you didn't thank her for it. The gate itself was managed by a contracted security vendor, and their site supervisor, Mr. D, was basically the face of the system. He wasn't cruel, but he was obedient to whatever directive came down from the HOA. If the board wanted the gate to act like a bouncer, he would make it happen. So when the emergency happened, it didn't feel like a community moment. It felt like an opportunity waiting to be exploited. A resident's family member had a medical issue in the middle of the day. I didn't see the incident itself, but I saw the ripple. A neighbor running. A car pulled over with hazards blinking. Someone's hands shaking as they tried the keypad. Then the unmistakable sound of sirens, getting louder, then pausing as the ambulance slowed at the gate like it was deciding whether we were worth entering. The gate did open. It always opened, eventually. But it took too long. Later that evening, the community group chat lit up with nervous questions. People asked why the gate didn't default open for emergency vehicles. People asked whether the keypad recognized first responders. People asked whether anyone had authority to change that. Nobody blamed the person who made the call. If anything, people were grateful someone acted quickly. That's why it felt so disgusting when the HOA turned the whole thing into a crackdown. The next morning, there was a new piece of paper taped to the kiosk. Not a friendly flyer. Not a reminder. A formal-looking notice with bold headings and tightly packed text that seemed designed to make your eyes blur so you just accept it. It had a date stamp at the top and a subject line that practically hissed, "Emergency Access Protocol Violation." I stood there reading it while the sun warmed the back of my neck. Cars crept behind me, waiting. A couple of drivers honked, not aggressively, but impatiently, like my reading was an inconvenience. I stepped aside, finished scanning it, then took a photo. That dated notice became evidence prop number 1, and I didn't know it yet, but I was going to need it. The message claimed the 911 call exposed critical weaknesses in gate compliance. It said residents had been sharing access codes improperly, and that the board was implementing immediate corrective measures. Immediate, in HOA language, meant sudden, sweeping, and completely unaccountable. Then came the line that made my stomach drop. Within 72 hours, all existing entry codes would be disabled. Residents would have to register vehicles and submit updated contact information to receive a new access method. Guests would be restricted. Deliveries would be limited to designated hours. And any resident interfering with gate operations could face enforcement action. It was written like an ultimatum disguised as policy. The first wave of panic hit fast. Neighbors started messaging each other about it. Some people shrugged and said it wasn't a big deal, just update your info. Others were furious, especially anyone who had older parents, caregivers, or a rotating schedule that depended on flexible access. I thought about the ambulance, about those seconds, about how the gate slowed down something that couldn't afford to be slowed down. And then I thought about how the HOA was using that moment to tighten its grip, not improve emergency access. The kicker was this: the notice didn't mention improving emergency entry at all. It was all about resident control. I went home and dug out my HOA documents. I wasn't trying to start a war. I just didn't want to be gaslit into believing this was normal. I found the section of the governing rules about common area access and security features. The language was boring and broad, the kind that boards love because it gives them wiggle room. But there was also a section about rule changes and notice requirements. I highlighted it not because I expected a clean victory, but because I needed a foothold. That printout, highlighted CCR section, was evidence prop number 2. The rules said the board could adopt reasonable operating policies, but there were limits. There were procedures. There was supposed to be transparency. And there was absolutely nothing in there about punishing everyone for an emergency call. I wrote a calm email to management. Not accusatory. Not dramatic. Just a series of questions. What specifically triggered this change? What security incident had occurred? Where was the board vote? Where were the meeting minutes? I didn't ask for legal interpretations. I asked for records. When you're dealing with Karen neighbor drama at the board level, the most effective weapon isn't anger. It's documentation. The response I got back was fast and it was cold. Management informed me the board had declared it an urgent operational issue. Minutes would be available later. For now, residents were expected to comply. They included a link to an online form that asked for vehicle make, model, plate number, phone numbers, and emergency contacts. It was a data grab wrapped in fear. Worse, they added that anyone who failed to register could experience temporary access interruptions. Temporary. Like being locked out of your own neighborhood was a minor inconvenience. I could feel the pressure building across the community like steam in a sealed pot. In the following days, Ms. R started making her rounds with that polished certainty. She hovered near the gate in the mornings, greeting people with that too bright smile, casually mentioning the new safety plan, watching who nodded and who didn't. Mr. D, on the other hand, looked exhausted. He started showing up more often, clipboard in hand, checking the camera housing, fiddling with the keypad, telling people to be patient, as if patience could open a gate. By the second day, the gate began acting up more than usual. The arm would pause halfway, then drop. The keypad would accept a code, then flash red like it changed its mind. Cars stacked up. Tempers rose. People who were usually silent started yelling, not at each other, but at the system. At the concept of being trapped by a machine that was supposed to serve them. And that's when the HOA did what it always does in an HOA nightmare. It blamed the residents for reacting to the chaos it created. A new notice appeared, smaller this time, like a threat meant to be discovered. It warned that tailgating was prohibited and that violators would be reported. It mentioned fines in a vague way, the kind of language that could mean anything depending on how the board felt that day. I took a photo of that one too, then checked the first notice again. The 72-hour countdown wasn't just a deadline. It was leverage. It gave the board a reason to move fast, claim urgency, and shut down questions. So I changed tactics. Instead of arguing about whether they should do it, I focused on whether they were allowed to do it this way. I walked the neighborhood that afternoon and spoke to people in passing, but I didn't turn it into a rally. I asked simple questions. Did you see the ambulance hesitate? Did you see the gate fail? Have you ever had trouble getting in? Have you ever been denied entry by a malfunction? I didn't record anyone. I didn't pressure anyone. I just listened, then asked if they'd be willing to put their observations in writing as a short statement for the record. Some people refused. They didn't want to be involved. They were afraid of retaliation, which told me everything I needed to know about how this board operated. But others were relieved someone was taking it seriously. One neighbor described how her caregiver had been delayed at the gate the previous week, long before the emergency call. Another described a delivery driver trapped outside for 20 minutes because the code didn't work. A third described watching the ambulance pause while someone frantically punched the keypad. I collected these witness statements the old-fashioned way, a few sentences typed in an email, sent to me directly, with the date in the message. I wasn't building a case in court. I was building a narrative the board couldn't erase. At around the same time, rumors started spreading. Someone said Ms. R wanted to eliminate guest codes because outsiders didn't belong. Someone said the board was mad because emergency vehicles didn't check in with security like they were supposed to. Someone said the HOA had been warned by the security vendor that the system was outdated, and instead of paying for upgrades, the board was shifting blame to residents. I couldn't prove any of that yet. What I could prove was the paper trail. That night, I received a community-wide email from Ms. R through management. It was the kind of message designed to sound compassionate while scolding everyone. It mentioned community safety, responsible access behavior, and the unfortunate incident that required emergency services. It didn't say 911 directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew. Then it hit harder. The message claimed the board had unanimous support and that any resident spreading misinformation would be addressed. That line wasn't about safety. It was about intimidation. I read it twice, then saved it as a PDF, because sometimes the fastest way to win an HOA versus homeowner conflict is to assume someone will delete or rewrite what they said later. The next morning, the gate became a stage. Mr. D set up a folding table near the entrance. He had a stack of forms and a laminated sheet with bullet points about new procedures. Residents lined up like it was a checkpoint. Some looked embarrassed, like they were being forced into a compliance ritual. Others looked angry. A few looked smug, like obedience was a form of superiority. I stayed back and watched. Ms. R arrived mid-morning, dressed like she was attending a press conference. She moved from person to person with practiced concern, gesturing toward the gate, nodding as if she was listening. But her eyes kept flicking to the line, counting participation. When she spotted me, she changed direction. I didn't need dialogue to understand what she was trying to do. She wanted the public confrontation. She wanted me to react in front of witnesses. She wanted me to look like the troublemaker. So I didn't give it to her. I gave her professionalism. I walked up, took a form, and asked Mr. D for the board meeting agenda where this policy was approved. He blinked like I'd asked for the moon. He glanced at Ms. R. She stiffened. He said he didn't have it. I nodded, thanked him, and stepped away. But that small moment did something important. It made the absence visible. It signaled to the people watching that there might not be a clean process behind this. In a community like ours, social pressure matters. The board survives on the idea that it's orderly and legitimate. If you puncture that, even quietly, you change the temperature. By afternoon, the pressure cycle shifted from confusion to anger. A neighbor's teenager got stuck outside the gate after school because his code suddenly stopped working early. A delivery driver left packages on the sidewalk because he couldn't get in. A resident coming home from a late shift had to wait while someone else let her in, and she looked humiliated standing there, trapped by a metal arm. Then, as if on cue, management sent out another update. It said the board had instructed security to reduce tailgating. It reminded residents that unauthorized access would be treated as a violation. It strongly suggested that people who didn't submit their new registration would be deprioritized for assistance at the gate. Deprioritized. Like basic entry was a privilege the HOA could ration. I printed that email too. I was turning their intimidation into exhibits. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with everything spread out, the dated notice, the management email PDFs, my highlighted CCR section, and the witness statements in my inbox. I wasn't angry in a wild way. I was focused in a quiet way. The kind of focus that shows up when you realize the board isn't just annoying, it's dangerous in small, bureaucratic ways. Because if they could weaponize a 911 call, they could weaponize anything. And right then I decided I was done being reactive. I drafted a formal request to management for records related to the urgent operational issue. I requested the board meeting notice, the agenda, and the minutes. I requested any security vendor recommendations referenced in the decision. I asked for the policy text the board was enforcing and the authority they were using to implement it without proper resident notice. I kept the tone neutral and respectful. No accusations. No threats. Just a request that forced them to either provide the documents or admit they didn't exist. Then I sent a separate, shorter message to the community group chat, careful not to inflame panic. I told them I'd collected several written observations about gate failures and that I'd requested board records. I asked if anyone else had experienced lockouts or delays and wanted to share a brief account for the record. Within minutes, more messages came in. People were scared. People were furious. People were tired of being treated like suspects in their own neighborhood. And right in the middle of it, someone posted a photo from the entrance. A new paper had been taped to the kiosk. Not the original notice. Not a reminder. A fresh sheet, cleaner, sharper, with a different font, like it had been drafted in a hurry by someone who wanted it to look official. It was an agenda excerpt for an emergency board session. Evidence prop number 3. I zoomed in on the photo until the words sharpened. Emergency session topics, gate access enforcement, resident compliance measures, and disciplinary protocol for interference. My stomach dropped at that last phrase. Disciplinary protocol. For interference. And I knew, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that they weren't just trying to change codes. They were preparing to make an example out of someone, and the only person asking for records was me. I grabbed my keys and headed for the gate, because I had to see the paper with my own eyes before it mysteriously disappeared. When I pulled up, the line was gone, but the tension was still there, like the air remembered. The excerpt was taped neatly under a plastic sleeve, as if someone expected it to be read and feared it would be ripped down. I took photos from multiple angles, making sure the date and time were visible. Then I noticed something else, a smaller line at the bottom, almost an afterthought. Implementation begins immediately following session. No explanation of what implementation meant. No details. No grace period. Just a promise that after the emergency session, the gate would become whatever the board wanted it to be. And as I stood there, staring at that one line, my phone buzzed with an email notification from management. Subject, Notice of Compliance Review. I opened it, and the first sentence confirmed exactly what I'd feared. The board had scheduled a compliance review regarding my pattern of interference with operational security protocols, and it would take place before the 72-hour deadline expired. My throat tightened. They weren't just changing the gate. They were coming for me next. The email sat open on my phone like a dare. Notice of Compliance Review. It didn't accuse me of anything specific. It didn't cite a rule number. It didn't even pretend to offer due process beyond a vague invitation to attend and be heard. It was written the way an HOA writes when it's trying to sound official enough to scare you, but flexible enough to wiggle out later. I read it again in my kitchen, the light from the screen reflecting off the paper evidence spread across my table. The dated gate notice. The management emails saved as PDFs. The agenda excerpt photo with the phrase disciplinary protocol for interference. All of it was starting to fit into one ugly picture. They weren't reacting to the emergency. They were reacting to scrutiny. If they could paint questions as interference, then they could punish anyone who asked them. They could keep the gate rules vague and enforce them however they wanted. And they could do it fast, before residents had time to organize. Within 72 hours wasn't a safety timeline. It was a power move. I forced myself to slow down and breathe. This was the moment where people usually snap. They write a rant. They confront the president at the gate. They storm into the management office. And that's exactly what boards like Ms. R's count on. They need you emotional so they can label you irrational. So I did the opposite. I treated it like a paperwork problem. First, I replied to management with one sentence: I will attend. Please provide the specific rule provisions and evidence supporting the allegation. No adjectives. No anger. Just a request that made their threat concrete. Second, I forwarded the compliance review email to myself and saved it, because if they changed the language later, I wanted the original timestamp. Third, I made a simple folder on my laptop, Gate Crackdown. Inside it, subfolders for notices, emails, and witness statements. Then I did something that felt small but mattered. I wrote down a timeline on a notepad. The emergency. The first notice. The countdown. The new tailgating warning. The agenda excerpt. The compliance review. In a normal neighborhood, that would be overkill. In a homeowners association drama situation, a timeline is survival. The next morning, the gate was worse. Maybe it was the system being stressed. Maybe it was intentional. Either way, the result was chaos. Cars stacked deeper than I'd ever seen. Residents were waving hands out windows, signaling others to back up or go around. A couple of people got out to press the call button, and each time the intercom crackled, nobody answered. I watched from my porch for a while, close enough to see the frustration but far enough to avoid becoming the target again. Then I noticed Mr. D at the kiosk, not at his table anymore, but standing like a human shield between the gate and the residents. Ms. R arrived shortly after. She moved with purpose, like she'd rehearsed this scene. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She did something smarter. She performed. She pointed at the line of cars as if it proved her. She gestured to the keypad as if it was broken because residents were irresponsible. She leaned in to listen to complaints, then turned away with a pained expression, like she was the victim of everyone else's behavior. She wasn't fixing anything. She was creating the visual of crisis. And then she did the thing that turned my stomach. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Not of the broken gate arm. Not of the intercom. Not of the camera housing that had been flickering since last month. Pictures of license plates. I knew because I watched her angle the phone low and steady, the way you do when you want proof of who was there. It wasn't about security. It was about building a list. I walked inside, opened my email, and started drafting another message to management. Not to accuse her of photographing plates. That would turn into a debate. Instead, I asked a question with a neat little trap inside it. I asked whether the HOA was collecting resident vehicle data through on-site photography and whether that data would be stored, shared, or used for enforcement. Again, paperwork problem. If they answered yes, it created accountability. If they answered no, it boxed them in if the photos ever surfaced. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another community-wide update. This one was shorter and harsher. It repeated the deadline. It warned residents that non-compliance was the reason for delays. It advised everyone to avoid spreading rumors about the board's actions and to direct all questions to management. Direct all questions to management. That was the tell. When a board tries to route everything through management, it's usually because management can hide behind procedure and delay, while the board avoids direct responsibility. I didn't respond immediately. I waited. Then I did the most boring, powerful thing you can do in a petty HOA revenge story. I asked for minutes again. Because they still hadn't given them to me. Meanwhile, the witness statements kept coming. People who had been silent before were now frustrated enough to write. One resident described being stuck outside with groceries melting in the car. Another described a rideshare refusing to enter, leaving them walking from the main road. Another described a caregiver forced to wait until a stranger let them in. All these stories had something in common. The board's safety plan was creating more risk, not less. I organized them into a simple document with bullet points, each one phrased as an observation, not an accusation. I removed names. I kept dates only as general references like yesterday morning or last week, because I didn't want anyone to feel exposed. Then I sent management a second formal request, this time with a clear purpose. Please include these operational impacts in the board record for the emergency session. If the board wanted to act like this was a crisis, then the record needed to show the crisis they were causing. That afternoon, management finally responded. They didn't provide the minutes. They didn't provide the agenda beyond what was already posted. They didn't provide a rule section for my alleged interference. Instead, they wrote that the board's compliance review was a routine conversation and that my questions were being interpreted by some as undermining the community's safety effort. Translated, Ms. R was offended someone asked for documentation. So I replied politely and asked again for the specific rule provision and evidence. I attached the highlighted CCR section about notice and rule adoption procedures. Not as a threat. As a reference. Then I added one more request. I asked if the emergency session would allow residents to submit written comments for the record. Because I knew what was coming. They wanted a closed meeting with no witnesses, then an outcome they could summarize however they wanted. If I could force a written record into it, I could limit their ability to rewrite history. That evening, I got a message from someone in the group chat. It wasn't a name I recognized. It was just a neighbor who didn't usually speak up. They said they'd overheard Ms. R telling someone that the board would identify agitators and restrict access until compliance improves. The message wasn't proof. It was rumor. But it made the pattern clearer. The board was framing obedience as safety. And it was working on some people. The next morning, the compliance review took place. It was held in a small community room near the pool, the kind with folding chairs and a cheap clock that always runs a minute fast. Management sat at a table with a notepad. Mr. D was there too, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Ms. R arrived last, as if she wanted the room to settle before her presence shifted it. I won't quote anyone. I won't turn it into a courtroom drama. But I'll tell you exactly what happened in plain narration. They didn't bring evidence. They brought vibes. They described my emails as excessive. They described my questions as disruptive. They described my conversations with neighbors as inciting frustration. I asked, calmly, which specific rule prohibited residents from requesting meeting minutes or operational details. I asked what evidence supported the claim that I interfered with security operations. I asked whether my attendance and questions at the gate table constituted interference or simply participation. Each time, they responded with general statements about community harmony and trust in leadership. They wanted me to accept authority as proof of authority. And then Ms. R leaned into the real threat. She indicated the board could suspend gate access methods for residents who refused to cooperate. Suspending gate access. Not a fine. Not a warning. A restriction that would affect my daily life and force me to rely on others to enter my own neighborhood. It was the kind of punishment that didn't look like violence, but felt like it. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I nodded, took notes, and asked whether that policy existed in writing. They said it was under consideration. Under consideration, but apparently ready enough to threaten. I asked management to confirm, in writing, that no access restriction would be placed on my property without a board vote and written notice. Management hesitated, the way people do when they realize they're being pulled into the spotlight. They said they would follow up. So I ended the meeting with one final request. Please provide the minutes of this compliance review and the emergency session agenda, and please include my written witness summary in the record. Then I walked out. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. Because as I stepped into the hallway, I saw two residents standing by the doorway pretending to check their phones, but watching me with that wary look people get when they think someone is making trouble. That was Ms. R's real strategy. Not enforcement. Social shame. She wanted the community to police itself. I went home and did the thing that always matters in an HOA versus Karen scenario. I controlled the narrative before someone else did. I wrote a short, careful message to the group chat. I said I attended the compliance review, that no specific rule violation was presented, and that I requested written confirmation of any access restrictions. I reminded everyone that the board still hadn't provided the emergency session minutes or policy text. And I encouraged anyone experiencing lockouts or delays to document it, because operational changes should be accountable. I didn't call anyone a liar. I didn't insult the board. I made it about process. Within an hour, the chat shifted. People started sharing their own photos of the gate line. People started posting screenshots of management emails. Someone posted the tailgating warning again and pointed out it didn't cite any rule number either. Suddenly, it wasn't just me. It was a pattern the community could see. And the board felt it. That night, another notice appeared at the gate. This one wasn't about registration. It wasn't about compliance. It was a warning. It stated that residents must not interfere with security staff and must not photograph or distribute security protocols. That phrase was vague enough to include almost anything. Photograph or distribute security protocols. In other words, stop taking pictures of our notices. Stop sharing our emails. Stop documenting. I went back to the CCR section again. I compared it with the new notice. The board could call anything a protocol if it wanted to. That's when I realized the real battle wasn't the gate. It was information. If the board could restrict information, it could control the story. If it could control the story, it could justify anything. So I escalated in the safest, most boring way possible. I sent management a formal records request for all gate-related communications and board actions regarding the emergency call and the access changes. I referenced my prior requests. I attached the dated notices and the agenda excerpt photo. I included the witness statement summary. I asked for a response within a reasonable time frame. I also requested confirmation that emergency responders would not be delayed by the new procedures. That last part mattered most, because the board had used the emergency as an excuse, but it still hadn't fixed the emergency problem. By the next morning, the clock was tightening. The deadline was approaching like a storm line. And then it happened. I tried to exit the neighborhood to run an errand, and the gate arm lifted, then dropped mid-lane, stopping my car like a barricade. The system had flagged me. Not the car behind me. Not the car in front. A red light blinked on the kiosk, and a message flashed on the tiny screen. Access pending review. My chest went cold. Pending review. That phrase was the HOA's favorite kind of punishment, vague, deniable, and humiliating. Cars stacked behind me. Someone honked. I could feel the heat of their irritation. I pressed the intercom button. Static. Then Mr. D's tired voice came through, saying he couldn't open it for me without authorization. Without authorization. I asked calmly who authorized it. He said the board. I asked whether there was written notice. He hesitated, then said he was just following directives. And then I saw Ms. R's car pull up to the side like she'd been waiting for this moment. She stepped out, not rushing, not panicked, with that same polished expression. This was her stage again. I could practically feel her thinking, now everyone can see what happens when you don't comply. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even get out of my car. Instead, I did something that made her pause. I held my phone up, not filming faces, not recording audio in a dramatic way, just capturing the kiosk message and the gate status, and then I sent it to management with one line. Please confirm in writing why my access has been restricted and what record authorizes it. Then I sent a second message to the group chat, with a photo of the kiosk screen. No commentary. Just the image. Then I walked out. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. Because as I stepped into the hallway, I saw two residents standing by the doorway pretending to check their phones, but watching me with that wary look people get when they think someone is making trouble. That was Ms. R's real strategy. Not enforcement. Social shame. She wanted the community to police itself. I went home and did the thing that always matters in an HOA versus Karen scenario. I controlled the narrative before someone else did. I wrote a short, careful message to the group chat. I said I attended the compliance review, that no specific rule violation was presented, and that I requested written confirmation of any access restrictions. I reminded everyone that the board still hadn't provided the emergency session minutes or policy text. And I encouraged anyone experiencing lockouts or delays to document it, because operational changes should be accountable. I didn't call anyone a liar. I didn't insult the board. I made it about process. Within an hour, the chat shifted. People started sharing their own photos of the gate line. People started posting screenshots of management emails. Someone posted the tailgating warning again and pointed out it didn't cite any rule number either. Suddenly, it wasn't just me. It was a pattern the community could see. And the board felt it. That night, another notice appeared at the gate. This one wasn't about registration. It wasn't about compliance. It was a warning. It stated that residents must not interfere with security staff and must not photograph or distribute security protocols. That phrase was vague enough to include almost anything. Photograph or distribute security protocols. In other words, stop taking pictures of our notices. Stop sharing our emails. Stop documenting. I went back to the CCR section again. I compared it with the new notice. The board could call anything a protocol if it wanted to. That's when I realized the real battle wasn't the gate. It was information. If the board could restrict information, it could control the story. If it could control the story, it could justify anything. So I escalated in the safest, most boring way possible.